It was well past midnight when Ryan's car gave a final sputter and coasted to a stop in the middle of a desolate road. The storm had been relentless for hours, sheets of rain hammering against the windshield, the wipers barely able to keep up. He cursed under his breath and checked his phone. No signal. The road stretched endlessly in both directions, swallowed by the darkness and rain. No lights, no cars, nothing. Of course, this would happen now, Ryan muttered, pulling his coat tighter around himself. As he sat in the suffocating silence, he noticed a faint light in the distance, flickering through the downpour. A house, maybe half a mile away, hidden behind a veil of rain and fog. It was his only chance at finding help. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped out into the storm. The rain was colder than he'd expected, stinging his skin like icy needles. With no other choice, he began walking toward the light. The road was slick, and every gust of wind made the trees groan, as if they were warning him to turn back. The light grew closer, but with it came an overwhelming sense of isolation. The house looked ancient, its roof sagging under years of decay, windows barely holding on behind rotting frames. It stood at the end of a long dirt path that seemed more like a forgotten memory than a road. Ryan hesitated, shivering in the cold as the wind howled through the trees. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but he had no choice. The door opened before he could knock. An old man stood in the doorway, his face half lit by a single flickering lantern. He had a kind smile, though his eyes were strange, unfocused, as if he were staring through Ryan rather than at him. "Trouble on the road?" the man asked in a gravelly voice. He spoke calmly, almost too calmly for the middle of such a chaotic storm. "Yeah," Ryan stammered, unnerved by the man's sudden appearance. "My car broke down. I'm hoping to find a mechanic." The old man chuckled. "A mechanic? Out here?" "Not tonight, son. This storm's too rough for anyone to be out there, but you can stay here till morning. No need to worry about a thing." Ryan wanted to refuse, wanted to say no and run back to his car, but the warmth of the house compared to the unforgiving storm was too much to resist. "Thanks. I really appreciate it." The inside of the house was surprisingly warm, the air thick with the smell of burning wood and something faintly metallic. As Ryan stepped inside, the floorboards groaned beneath his weight, the sound echoing through the dimly lit hallway. The old man introduced himself as Mr. Holloway and gestured toward the living room. A fire crackled in the hearth, but the shadows it cast seemed deeper, darker than they should have been. The room was cluttered with old furniture and faded photographs, all of them framed with an unsettling precision, as if someone had obsessively maintained them for decades. "Must be lonely out here," Ryan said, trying to make conversation, his eyes darting to the photographs. There were no pictures of anyone except the old man and a woman, presumably his wife, and 2 children. "Not as lonely as you'd think," Mr. Holloway replied, his tone oddly cheerful. "Plenty of company, even when you don't see them." Ryan's stomach twisted. The fire popped loudly, startling him out of his thoughts. "You must be tired," Mr. Holloway continued, suddenly serious. "You should rest. Upstairs, first room on the right." Ryan nodded, the unease gnawing at him, but he was exhausted, his clothes still damp from the rain. "Thanks again. I'll be out of your hair by morning." As Ryan climbed the creaky staircase, he felt as though unseen eyes were following him. He reached the room Mr. Holloway had indicated. The bed was old-fashioned, the kind with tall posts and heavy blankets. Everything about the room felt frozen in time. He collapsed onto the bed, too tired to think straight, though the lingering sense of something being off haunted him. Sometime deep in the night, Ryan awoke with a jolt. He could hear the rain pounding against the windows, but something else filled the room. A sound, faint but unmistakable. A distant humming, almost like a lullaby, coming from the hallway. He sat up, heart pounding. The air in the room felt wrong, heavy with something he couldn't define. Slowly, he crept to the door and opened it just a crack. There, at the end of the hallway, was a figure. It wasn't Mr. Holloway. It was too small. It looked like a child, standing with its back turned toward him, facing the door of another room down the hall. The child's head tilted unnaturally to one side, as though listening for something. Ryan's breath caught in his throat. He backed away from the door, his pulse racing. His logical mind screamed that it was just his imagination, that it had to be a trick of the light or a dream. But the humming persisted, growing louder, more unsettling. Suddenly, a soft knock echoed through the room, not at the door, but from inside the walls. Then came scratching, faint at first, but increasing in intensity. Ryan backed away from the walls, heart thundering in his chest. The sound surrounded him, filling the room with an unnatural pressure. He had to get out. Now. Ryan bolted from the room, half expecting to see the child standing in the hallway. But it was empty. He rushed downstairs, the house groaning with every step as if protesting his movement. The front door was locked. Hadn't it been unlocked earlier? Desperately he pulled at it, yanking the handle until the wood cracked, finally bursting open. He fled into the storm without looking back, sprinting to his car, the rain soaking through his clothes. He jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life this time, as if the car, too, was desperate to leave that place. Morning light filtered through the clouds by the time Ryan reached a small town. He pulled over at a diner, shaking as he sat at the counter, replaying the night's events in his mind. But something gnawed at him. He had to know. Before leaving, he drove back to the house in daylight. He'd thank Mr. Holloway for his hospitality, even if the night had been strange. When he returned to the house, it was different. The once warm and lit home now stood in ruin. Windows shattered, roof caved in, as if it had been abandoned for years. The eerie chill returned as Ryan stepped inside. It felt colder than the rain outside. His eyes fell on the photograph on the wall, the one that hadn't been there last night. It was a family portrait. Mr. Holloway stood beside his wife and 2 children, their smiles frozen in time. But the plaque beneath the photo sent ice through Ryan's veins. The Holloway family, 1964. Died in the Hollow Road fire, December 25th, 1964. Ryan staggered backward, heart pounding in his chest, as the soft sound of humming filled the air behind him. He didn't look back this time. Rajiv Kapoor, the CEO of a major corporation, had made the decision to take a shortcut on his way to Delhi. His schedule was packed, and he couldn't afford any delays. The GPS suggested a route through a remote area, and despite warnings of an incoming snowstorm, Rajiv, a man used to control, pressed forward. As the weather worsened, the snow came down like a thick blanket, engulfing the road and everything around it. Rajiv's car engine sputtered, coughed, and finally gave out. He cursed under his breath, slamming the steering wheel. There was no signal on his phone, and he was miles from the nearest town. Panic began to creep into his chest. Through the swirling snow, he noticed a faint light in the distance. A mansion, standing tall and grim, its silhouette barely visible against the storm. With no other options, Rajiv wrapped his coat tighter around himself and trudged toward the mansion, the wind howling in his ears. The mansion looked like it belonged to another era, its grandeur long faded. A plaque near the gate read, Kaidi Haveli, the prisoner's mansion. As he approached the door and knocked, the wooden structure creaked open slowly, revealing an elderly man. His face was deeply lined with age, but his eyes were sharp, cold. "You must be stranded," the old man said, his voice a gravelly whisper. "Come in. The storm is merciless tonight." Rajiv hesitated but nodded, stepping inside. The warmth of the mansion was deceptive. The air felt heavy, oppressive, like a courtroom before a trial. "I'm Judge Verma," the old man introduced himself. "Retired now, but this place still serves its purpose." Rajiv glanced around the dimly lit room. Other figures sat in silence. A man with a brutish build and a steely expression sat sharpening a large blade by the fire, his hands steady and deliberate. "That's Narayan," Judge Verma said, gesturing to the man. "He was an executioner once." Rajiv's skin prickled as his eyes moved to the others. 2 men, sharply dressed in black suits, sat in the corner, their eyes cold and calculating. "They're lawyers," Verma continued. "Mr. Gupta and Mr. Sharma. They once argued on opposite sides of the courtroom, but now they work together." In the farthest corner sat a young man, staring blankly at the floor. His face was gaunt, his hands twitching as if he couldn't escape some invisible chain. "He was a prisoner once," the judge said softly. "His crimes, well, we don't speak of those anymore." Rajiv shifted uncomfortably. Something was deeply wrong with this place. And yet, before he could excuse himself, a young woman entered the room. She moved gracefully, yet there was something eerie about her presence. She placed a cup of tea in front of Rajiv without a word. "That's Pooja," the judge said with a faint smile. "She helps around the mansion." Rajiv took the tea, though his instincts screamed at him not to. He tried to keep his composure. I appreciate the hospitality, Judge, but if I could just use your phone, I can arrange for help and be out of your way. Judge Verma's smile widened. Ah, we don't have phones here. But you'll stay the night, won't you? It's dangerous out there in the storm. Something in the judge's voice suggested that leaving was not an option. As the evening wore on, Rajiv noticed something strange. Everyone in the mansion seemed to know him. They spoke of his past decisions, his ruthless business dealings, his moral compromises. The lawyers hinted at contracts he had bent to his favor. The prisoner talked about injustice, and the judge, well, he watched silently as if awaiting a moment to strike. Unnerved, Rajiv finally stood up. I'm not staying here. I'll walk back if I have to. As he turned toward the door, the executioner, Narayan, blocked his path, the large blade gleaming in the dim light. You can't leave, Judge Verma said, his voice now cold and authoritative. You see, this mansion has a purpose. We call it Kaidi Haveli for a reason. Every guest that steps in here is judged, just as we were once judged. Rajiv's heart raced. Judged? For what? For your crimes, the judge said softly, leaning forward. Crimes you may not even realize you've committed. Suddenly the room shifted. Hidden cameras blinked from the corners, and the walls seemed to close in. It was all a setup. This wasn't just a mansion. It was a courtroom, a prison, and a death trap all in one. The others stood, forming a circle around Rajiv. Everyone here has been judged by the law, but the law can be bent, the judge continued, so we formed our own kind of justice. The executioner grinned, and the lawyers exchanged knowing glances. Rajiv backed away, his mind spinning. What do you want from me? We want you to play the game, Pooja whispered, her voice chillingly calm. A trial. Here, we play with the law, the way people like you do in real life. The judge raised his hand, and a large screen flickered on, revealing footage of Rajiv's life. His face paled as he watched himself making deals, bribing officials, cutting corners to maintain his empire, no matter who got hurt in the process. You've harmed many, Mr. Kapoor, Judge Verma said gravely, and now it's time to face the consequences. Rajiv's heart thundered in his chest. He turned to run, but the mansion seemed to twist around him. No matter where he went, there was no escape. The doors wouldn't open, the windows were barred. Narayan loomed closer, his blade sharp and ready. Run, if you want, the judge said softly, but we always catch those who try. Rajiv bolted toward the back of the mansion, adrenaline pumping through his veins. He found a back door and burst through it into the snowstorm. But as he ran, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. He could hear footsteps behind him, but every time he looked back, there was no one. The storm seemed to swallow everything, but the cameras, they were everywhere, hidden in the trees, watching his every move. Breathless and cold, he collapsed in the snow, his body giving in to exhaustion. The last thing he saw was a figure standing over him and the sharp glint of a blade. When he awoke, he was back in the mansion, tied to a chair in the center of the room. The judge, the lawyers, the prisoner, and the executioner all stood around him, watching. The trial begins, Judge Verma declared, his voice echoing through the chamber. Rajiv's screams echoed through the mansion as the law, twisted and corrupt, began to play its game. No one ever left Katie alive. In the heart of the monsoon season, David Campbell, a real estate developer, was driving through the winding roads of a small, rural town called Ravenwood in search of a potential property to flip. He had heard rumors of an old estate hidden deep in the woods, abandoned, decaying, but ripe with the potential for profit. The weather had been relentless all day, with the sky pouring sheets of rain, turning the roads into rivers of mud. David knew he should have waited for clearer skies, but time was money, and he couldn't afford delays. The GPS signal wavered, and his phone battery was nearly dead, but the directions led him deeper into the countryside, further away from any signs of civilization. As the rain lashed down harder, David's windshield wipers struggled to keep up. His headlights barely penetrated the heavy downpour, and the dark, towering trees on either side of the road seemed to close in around him. Just as he contemplated turning back, his car jerked violently, tires spinning in the muck before the engine coughed and died. David cursed, trying the ignition again, but it was no use. Stuck miles from the nearest town, he stepped out of the car, the rain instantly soaking him to the bone. The cold wind bit at his skin as he squinted through the downpour. A faint light flickered through the sheets of rain, a house just barely visible up ahead. It was his only hope. David sloshed through the muddy path, shoes sinking into the earth with every step until he finally reached the house. It was an old, dilapidated mansion, its shutters creaking in the wind, paint peeling from the walls. Something about it felt wrong, but with the storm intensifying, he had no other option. He knocked on the heavy wooden door, the sound echoing ominously through the rain. A long pause. Just as David was about to knock again, the door creaked open slightly, revealing a woman in her mid-50s. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and unblinking. She wore an old-fashioned dress, the kind that didn't seem to belong to this era. She regarded David with a strange look before speaking in a soft, almost whispering voice. "You must be stranded," she said, her tone carrying an eerie calmness. "Please, come in. The rain is unforgiving tonight." David hesitated, something about the woman unnerving him, but he was soaked, cold, and desperate. He stepped inside, the warmth of the house enveloping him. The interior was much grander than the outside suggested. Ornate furniture, tall ceilings, and an air of something old and forgotten. A fire crackled in the hearth, but the shadows it cast on the walls seemed to dance in unnatural patterns. "Thank you," David said, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. "My car broke down, and there's no signal. Do you happen to have a phone I could use?" The woman smiled faintly. "There are no phones here, I'm afraid. The storm has knocked everything out, but you're welcome to stay the night until it clears up." She gestured toward a large sitting room where a man sat in a high-backed chair, staring at the fire. He turned his head slightly as David entered, his expression unreadable. "My husband, Robert," the woman introduced him. "He doesn't speak much these days." David nodded, offering a polite smile, though the atmosphere of the house made his skin crawl. The rain pounded harder against the windows, and the wind howled, rattling the old glass panes. "I'll show you to your room," the woman said, her voice soft and distant as though it were coming from another world. David followed her up a grand staircase that creaked with every step. The walls were lined with old, faded portraits, faces that seemed to watch him as he passed. They reached a room at the end of the long, dimly lit hallway. The door opened with a low groan, revealing a modest bedroom. "You can rest here," she said, her eyes lingering on him for a moment longer than necessary. "I'll fetch you some dry clothes." David thanked her, though the unease clung to him like the dampness of his clothes. As the door closed behind him, he took a deep breath, trying to shake the unsettling vibe. His phone was dead, the rain showed no signs of letting up, and the mansion felt wrong. He laid down on the bed, the old mattress creaking under his weight. Exhaustion began to overtake him, but just as he was about to drift off, he heard something, a faint whispering sound. At first he thought it was the wind, but it grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't words, just a low, eerie whisper, like someone speaking just beyond the edge of hearing. David sat up, heart racing. The room was still, but the whispering continued, coming from the walls, or was it the floor? Then he noticed something. Water. A small trickle of rainwater was seeping from the ceiling, running down the walls. But it wasn't just water. Mixed in with the rain were faint streaks of red. Blood. David's stomach turned. He stumbled out of bed, backing away from the walls as the whispers grew louder, almost chanting now. The light in the room flickered, casting grotesque shadows that seemed to shift and move on their own. He rushed to the door, pulling it open, and ran down the hallway, his heart pounding in his chest. The mansion had changed. The once grand hallway was now warped and twisted, the portraits on the walls distorted, their eyes hollow, mouths open in silent screams. The whispering was everywhere, growing louder, following him. David made his way down the stairs, slipping on the wet, rotting wood. He reached the sitting room, but it was empty. The fire was out, and the room was dark, save for the faint glow of lightning through the windows. "Robert? Mrs. Harris?" he called, but his voice was swallowed by the house. Suddenly, the whispering stopped. The silence was worse. It pressed in on him, thick and suffocating. Then, from the darkness, a voice spoke, a voice not his own. "You shouldn't have come here." David whipped around, and there, standing in the doorway, was Robert. But he wasn't the man he had seen earlier. His face was twisted, eyes black as coal, and his mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. Behind him, Mrs. Harris appeared, her once kind face now gaunt and skeletal, her eyes burning with an unnatural light. "This house is ours," she whispered, her voice no longer soft but filled with malice. "And now, so are you." David backed away, but the shadows moved faster, wrapping around him, pulling him into the darkness. The last thing he heard was the rain pounding against the windows, mingled with the sound of distant whispers. In the morning, the storm cleared, and the mansion stood as silent and still as ever. David Campbell was never seen again. But on rainy nights, when the storm howls through Ravenwood, locals say you can still hear the faint whispers coming from the old mansion, the voices of those who ventured inside, never to return. In the small town of Ridgeway, nestled deep in the rainy forests of Washington state, Officer Jack Malone had seen his share of strange cases, but nothing quite like this. It was the middle of a stormy autumn night when he was called in to investigate a double homicide at a secluded cabin on the edge of town. The cabin belonged to a married couple, George and Linda Walker, who were found brutally murdered. The rain poured down relentlessly, turning the dirt road leading to the cabin into a river of mud. The wind howled through the trees, and the storm had knocked out power to most of the town, leaving the area drenched in darkness. When Jack arrived, two people sat inside the police cruiser parked outside the cabin: Vikram Vic Patel, a local contractor, and Maya Thompson, a young schoolteacher. They were drenched, their clothes soaked from the rain, and their faces pale with shock. They were the only two witnesses to the crime, but something about their stories didn't sit right with Jack. The tension between them was palpable, and he could feel the weight of unspoken secrets hanging in the air. Jack approached the car and tapped on the window. Vic glanced up with red-rimmed eyes, his jaw clenched. Maya sat next to him, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, staring out at the rain-soaked forest. "I need to talk to you both," Jack said firmly. "Separately." He directed Vic into the cabin's living room, which had been turned into a makeshift interrogation room. The rain drummed against the windows, the sound almost deafening as Jack sat across from Vic. His hands were shaking, and he kept glancing nervously out the window as if expecting something or someone to appear. "Let's start from the beginning," Jack said, his voice calm but authoritative. "What happened tonight?" Vic swallowed hard, running a hand through his wet hair. "We were having dinner, just a normal night. The Walkers, George, he was an old friend, Linda, I didn't know her as well. But everything was fine until... Until what?" Jack leaned forward, watching Vic carefully. "Until the power went out," Vic whispered. "The storm knocked it out, and it got dark, really dark. We lit candles, tried to keep the mood light. But then we heard something. A noise outside the cabin. George went to check, and Linda followed." "And then," Jack pressed. Vic's face contorted with emotion. "I heard a scream. When I ran outside, George was lying in the mud, dead. His throat was..." He stopped, his voice cracking. "Linda was standing there, covered in blood, and then she just collapsed. She was dead too, but I didn't see anyone else." Jack studied him. "You didn't see anyone else, but you're sure they were both murdered?" "Yes," Vic said, his voice barely audible. "They didn't kill themselves." The story didn't make sense, and Jack knew it. There was more to this than Vic was letting on. He decided to switch tactics and interrogate Maya. Leaving Vic in the living room, Jack led Maya into the cabin's small kitchen. She sat down stiffly, her eyes darting toward the darkened window, as if the storm outside held some terrible secret. "Maya," Jack began gently, "I need you to tell me what happened tonight. Vic said you were all having dinner, then the power went out. Is that right?" Maya nodded slowly, but her eyes remained unfocused. "Yes, that's right. But it wasn't just the storm. Something was wrong from the beginning." Jack raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "George and Linda," Maya said quietly, her voice trembling. "They were acting strange. George kept looking at Linda like he was afraid of her. And Linda, she kept whispering things under her breath, things I couldn't hear. But it was like they were in their own world. Vic didn't notice, but I did." "What kind of things?" Jack asked, his interest piqued. Maya shook her head. "I don't know. It was like she was casting a spell or something, like she was trying to summon something." Jack felt a chill creep up his spine, despite the warmth of the room. "Summon something?" Maya's gaze finally met his. "I know it sounds crazy, but after the power went out, I felt it. Something evil. It was in the room with us, watching us. And then when George went outside, that's when it happened. What happened? The thing she summoned, Maya whispered. It killed them. Jack felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. You're telling me something supernatural killed George and Linda? Maya nodded slowly, her eyes wide with terror. I know what I saw. There was something there in the rain watching us. It took them. And it's still out there. Jack wasn't sure if Maya was telling the truth or if she was in shock, but her story didn't match Vic's at all. Vic claimed he didn't see anyone or anything else. Maya, on the other hand, believed something had been stalking them from the shadows. But there was one more thing that bothered him. Neither of them had mentioned why they were there in the first place. What had brought them to the Walkers' cabin on this stormy night? He returned to Vic, who was now pacing the room, looking increasingly agitated. Why were you and Maya at the cabin tonight? Jack asked directly. Vic froze, then turned to face him, his expression guarded. George invited us, said he needed to talk about something important. Important? Jack's brow furrowed. What was so important that he invited you out in the middle of a storm? Vic hesitated, his gaze shifting to the window again. I don't know, he was acting strange all week. He kept saying he had secrets. Secrets that could get him killed. Jack's blood ran cold. What kind of secrets? I don't know, Vic said, his voice rising in frustration. But he was scared, and now he's dead. Do you think that's a coincidence? Jack didn't believe in coincidences, especially not in a murder investigation. There was something more to this, something both Vic and Maya weren't telling him. The storm raged on, the rain pounding harder against the cabin, and Jack's mind raced. George had secrets. Maya believed something supernatural was involved. Vic seemed terrified of something he couldn't explain. As Jack prepared to confront them one last time, the lights flickered and then went out completely. The cabin was plunged into darkness, the only sound the relentless rain and the wind howling through the trees. A sharp knock came from the front door. Jack reached for his flashlight, his heart pounding in his chest. When he opened the door, no one was there, just the storm and the rain falling heavier than ever. But something was wrong. The air felt thick with a presence he couldn't explain, and he could feel it, the same thing Maya had described. Something was out there, lurking in the storm. Then a scream echoed from the living room. Jack rushed inside, but it was too late. Vic lay on the floor, his body twisted in an unnatural position, his eyes wide with terror. Maya stood frozen in the corner, Jack, her face pale as she whispered, "It's here. It's come for us." Jack stared at the body, dread settling in the pit of his stomach. There were no signs of a struggle, no intruder, nothing to explain how Vic had died so suddenly, except for the rain. As the storm raged outside, Jack realized Maya was right. There was something in the rain, something ancient, something evil. And it wasn't finished yet. The storm continued, and the cabin remained its prison. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like, comment, and share the video. See you next time.